Welcome to Animalogy, a podcast about language, the animal-related words and expressions we use every day, and how they affect and reflect our relationship with animals. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at ColleenPatrickGoudreau.com and this podcast at animalogypodcast.com. Of course, be sure to subscribe to Animalogy at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And thank you for sharing and leaving ratings and reviews. Supporting the podcast is the best way to keep it going, so help support this podcast at patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau. Dispersed between and among our regular episodes of Animalogy are special episodes in which I sit down with experts for whom the topics of language and animals converge. Today's episode is Food, Labels, Language, and the Law with Michele Simon. I've known Michele Simon for many, many years. She's a friend, she's a colleague, she's a neighbor. She lives just a couple miles from me here in Oakland, California. And we've been talking about this topic for ages. This topic being the language related to food and nutrition labels and the laws that govern them. We've talked privately many times about this topic, but I'm really glad to bring it to you publicly today. I think it's vital for the public to understand the laws, the language, and the politics around food labels because they directly affect our purchasing decisions, our health decisions, our food decisions, and they directly impact the animals who are unwittingly at the mercy of the language used to sell and promote products that come out of or off of their bodies. So there's a lot to talk about here, but of course, since this is a podcast called Animalogy about animals and language, we're going to focus on the language around labels as it pertains to animal products in general and to milk and related dairy words, cheese, yogurt, and ice cream in particular. Michele Simon is a public health lawyer who's been researching and writing about the food industry and food politics since 1996. She has written extensively and eloquently on the politics of food, including in her first book, Appetite for Profit, How the Food Industry Undermines Our Health and How to Fight Back. She's also executive director of the Plant-Based Foods Association, a trade group representing the nation's leading plant-based foods companies, and you'll hear more about that in a bit. One of the things we're going to talk about is the National Milk Producers Federation. They're one of the trade groups that represents the dairy industry, and they've been trying for years to make it illegal for non-dairy milk companies to use the word milk to refer to their plant-based milks, products that are, in healthy capitalist fashion, competing with and directly impacting the sales of cow's milk. And so the dairy industry obviously doesn't like this. And so even though they receive millions of dollars, tax dollars every year from the U.S. government in the form of subsidies and government buybacks, they've been petitioning the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the government entity that oversees and regulates food labels, to ask the FDA to forbid companies that make plant-based milks, such as almond or rice or cashew or soy, from using the word milk on their labels. They say that the word milk should be used to refer only to the lacteal secretions of cows. Just try telling a lactating mother that her baby's natural sustenance is, breast beverage or breast juice. But the dairy industry seems to think that they own the word milk and that plant milks, named as such, confuse the public. The FDA has essentially ignored these requests, but the dairy industry is stepping things up. I asked Michele to tell us what's going on.
The milk industry, for a variety of reasons, has been suffering. They tend to overproduce, so that creates a glut on the market. Sales have gone down because people aren't using as much milk in cereal. So many reasons that milk sales have been dropping long before even the rise of soy and almond and other alternative dairy milks. And so, what they're doing is just trying to find any way they can to attack this competition, this other sector that is on the rise. And, one of the ways that they have in their arsenal is this FDA definition of milk. So it's simply an attack by this industry that is losing market share, like I say, for a number of reasons, and unfortunately is just kind of grasping at straws.
So one of the things that I talk about a lot is us being aware of our language. So even when we talk about milk, we really need to clarify between, I think, cow's milk, animal milk, goat's milk, almond milk, plant milk, et cetera, because what they're saying is, and they're using this particular standard of identity, as it's called, right, as part of the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, where it has a definition, a standard of identity for milk that was established in 1938. So they're using this standard of identity to defend why they think the word milk should be used only to refer to that which comes from cows on food labels.
Well, the standards of identity have evolved over the years in many different ways, and standards of identity in general are a legitimate concept. They are meant to ensure that a particular industry sector adheres to certain standards for foods that they put out on the marketplace. And, the original reason for standards of identity for foods like cow's milk or any other food was to make sure that there weren't people coming into the market claiming that they were making a certain product when they really weren't. And so there are good reasons, good consumer protection reasons for making sure that there's some standardization for certain labels. But, in the age of innovation and in a time when consumers are seeking out all kinds of alternatives to traditional animal foods, unfortunately the regulations certainly just aren't keeping up with that innovation. And so we have a situation now where there are definitions of milk that are specific to cow's milk, but that obviously doesn't necessarily apply to a product like soy milk or almond milk, and the regulations simply aren't adequate to address that current reality.
So there have been examples then where the standards of identity have been changed over the years? For other foods? Okay.
Yeah, thanks to, lobbying by the dairy industry. I mean, a good example would be things like low-fat milk or, as nutrition evolves or sort of fads come and go, the industry wants to be able to label their products in different ways to respond to consumer interest and demand. And so, there's all kinds of changes in the standards of identity for companies to create alternative type of products. I mean, the irony is, they talk about there being this gold standard for foods when often they are the ones to ask FDA for a variant, allowance to create some kind of different type of product. Again, usually sometimes changing the nutrition status of a product, but sometimes just because perhaps they want to use cheaper ingredients. I mean, so it's definitely not a static thing. It's something that does evolve. Usually that's the hands of the industry that simply wants to change it at their whim.
Is it something that activists, plant milk lobbyists, et cetera, can do? I mean, asking the FDA to change the standard of identity for milk so that it includes milk from plants, is that something that could even be done, or is that even worth the effort?
Well, there's different possible approaches, and that is one approach. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because the odds of changing, the FDA definition of milk to actually incorporate plant-based versions is pretty slim. We're looking at a different approach, which is there's another part of FDA rules which allow for a common and usual name. And it must be said that the companies are currently operating under this kind of additional law that says if there isn't a definition, because not every food has a definition, obviously, right? Because there's all kinds of foods. So if you don't have, if there's not a standard definition for the food that you're putting on the marketplace, the FDA allows for the flexibility of using what's called a common or usual name. So that would be something like soy milk or almond milk. The common or usual name. It's a name that people kind of understand what it means when they pick up the product. And so what we're saying is, well, let's look at that type of approach to perhaps, put some standards around almond yogurts or other kinds of dairy products. There is a petition already, gathering dust in the FDA docket for soy milk. The definition of soy milk was actually proposed almost 20 years ago now by the Soy Foods Association, and because that industry recognized they wanted to put some standards around what soy milk means. But FDA hasn't adopted that definition. But in the wake of it, the soy milk industry has pretty much standardized its own practices. And so that's the kind of approach that we're thinking about at Plant-Based Foods Association, and we think could have some traction.
Well, it's interesting because when I look at what the milk lobby is saying is that they are still not satisfied, or are they? Tell me, are they satisfied if plant milks use the word milk as long as they use a qualifier like substitute or alternative, or as you're saying, a qualifier like soy, almond, or hemp, or coconut, etc.? Or are they not satisfied if the word milk is used at all?
The only word that, from what I gather, that they would be satisfied with, associated with milk, would be the word imitation.
Mm-hmm.
And because there are, certain rules around what makes for an imitation milk, and they maintain, at least in some of their grumblings, they maintain that these are imitation milks, and so, they have to be labeled as such. Obviously, there isn't a plant-based food company on the planet that's going to want to put the word imitation on their product. It's a pretty negative word. So in the absence of that, no, the milk industry would absolutely not be happy with, under their current, noise making, to use qualifiers, appropriate descriptors like soy or almond.
Which seems contradictory because they talk about, even on their website, that if it's a milk that comes from an animal, as long as there's a qualifier, so even an animal milk can't use the word milk because that word milk, under standards of identity, just means cow's milk. But they say that as long as there's a qualifier that includes the animal, goat's milk, sheep's milk, that would be okay. So why shouldn't that same standard apply, right?
Right. So that would be under the new law that they have drafted and put in the hands of their friends in Congress to propose. So under current law, the standard of identity for milk is only cow's milk. So in theory, anyone now selling goat's milk or camel milk, or whatever is out there, is violating the standard of identity. But because the dairy industry doesn't want to ruffle the feathers of their friends making, companion animal milks, they've proposed this change in the law to allow what they're calling hooved animals. So milk could be, allowed for any maker of a hooved animal milk, which is just funny to me because, I don't know, I guess that leaves out, like, other animals, right?
Right.
make milk. So, they just find clever ways to kind of shoehorn in whatever view of the world they want to have.
So we've been talking about them petitioning the FDA for 20 years. I mean, you said that there are things gathering dust from the soy milk lobby. What has been the reaction then of the FDA, and is the next step that the dairy industry is taking, bringing it to Congress, is that new because the FDA hasn't said no, it's okay for plant milks to use the word milk? So tell me about what the FDA's response has been to their petitioning and what the next step is that they're taking now.
So the response has been pretty much silence. There's been a couple of warning letters here and there, but only in the case of pretty overt mislabeling, misbranding, as FDA calls it. But in terms of the actual petitions that the dairy industry has filed over the years, the FDA has not responded to those. And my interpretation of that is pretty simple. The FDA has a lot of priorities and things on its plate and important issues to worry about, like are people getting sick from salmonella, more important issues to worry about than how soy milk is labeled. So, they have to pick and choose what they respond to, and they simply haven't prioritized this, and rightly so. So, yes, the dairy industry is, getting impatient and tired of asking FDA to act, and so they do what they do best and go to their friends in Congress and try to get action some other way. It's rather silly because the FDA has legal authority to act in a way that it chooses, and it has, in my opinion, acted by not acting. But the dairy industry obviously is not satisfied with that, and so they're trying this other tactic,
which is
to propose a bill which has been called the Dairy Pride Act, which is an acronym for something long and silly that I certainly am not going to try to commit to memory, but that's what they do. And so we have two companion bills now introduced, one in the House and one in the Senate, that would not just ask FDA to enforce what they interpret to be current law, as we've been discussing, but rather to create a much broader approach, and that would kind of redefine dairy foods in a certain way to encompass all dairy terminology and explicitly exclude and not allow any maker of a plant-based dairy alternative, whether it's milk, cheese, or yogurt, to be able to use any of those dairy-type terms. So that is a much broader approach than, what we interpret to be current law. And so they are looking to, take a broad sweep and basically not allow any company that's making a plant-based alternative to use a dairy term.
Like cheese, like yogurt, like ice cream.
Right. And they would also redefine the definition of milk, the way I described earlier, to be about hoofed animals, so they could, let their friends making goat milk keep using that term.
We'll get right back to Animalogy in just a moment. I just want to take a quick break to remind everyone that Animalogy is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast, including platinum supporters like, I'm going to change it up, Alexander Gray and David Cabrera, Gwen Mayo, Michal Stone, Amanda Klass, Jennifer and Ben Ellis, Tim Anderson, Renee Marinkovich, Ulrich, Sylvie Raquel, and Peter Liu. And I want to also give a huge thank you to A Well-Fed World, a hunger relief and animal protection organization whose grant is also making this podcast possible by signing up at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Listener supporters know they're making this podcast possible, and they appreciate the perks as well. So check out the different levels, choose your favorite at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, or go to animalogypodcast.com and click on the donate button. Thank you so much for valuing Animalogy. You are much valued in return. So are there already regulations in place that prevent plant-based cheeses and yogurts and ice creams from being called such? Because there are plant-based companies out there who are calling themselves, there's so much variety, and are they just taking precautionary measures? So when I look at Miyoko's cheese, for instance, it's called a cultured nut product. When you look at Follow Your Heart, their slices and their blocks say cheese alternative. You look at Daya, it says Swiss style, and cheddar style doesn't even ever say cheese. So are these companies taking precautionary measures, or what? Can you tell us a little bit about these companies?
Well, I would say just big picture, companies have decided to take different paths to how they label their products and for their own reasons. So I would say I can't speak to every single company's decision-making around how they land on how to label their products, but I think the very fact that, the way you just described the wide variation in how similar companies are choosing to label their products is an indicator that we have a challenge on our hands, and that current regulations are not giving companies enough guidance for how to label their foods in a consistent way, so that the consumer understands what it is, so that there's some understanding in the marketplace of what even the category is about. So I can tell you about Miyoko's situation because I know Miyoko Shinner, and she was actually the original inspiration for me to start the Plant-Based Food Association. So her challenge came about by way of her being based in California, and the state laws here are even worse in some ways than the federal laws, in that they are very explicit about not being able to use certain dairy terms. And so, she was basically told she couldn't use the word cheese on her cashew-based cheese product.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how they landed on this cultured nut product, and that was something that the state-level agency could live with. So, but yeah, obviously, cultured nut product doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but should also be said that it hasn't hurt the company that much in terms of how successful they've been. It's been growing by leaps and bounds, but it's still, not a good situation when you have that kind of phrase that really doesn't communicate properly to the consumer what you're trying to sell.
Of course. Yeah. And so just a few more examples. We've got ice creams, which I have to say, the plant-based ice creams, the non-dairy ice creams, it looks like across the board, they say frozen desserts or non-dairy frozen desserts. And yogurts, I see a variety. I see yogurt alternative, which is one of my least favorite words, along with imitation. I see cultured soy yogurt, non-dairy yogurt. So yeah, a real variety in terms of how they label themselves. So then just kind of in that same vein, we've also got a situation where we had a lawsuit brought up by a company that makes, a very prominent company that makes a well-known egg-based product, and they sued a company because of an eggless mayonnaise. So this is the lawsuit that Unilever filed against the company Hampton Creek in 2014 over labeling language and standards of identity around mayonnaise. So can you explain just very briefly what that claim was and what the outcome was?
Sure. Well, mayonnaise has a standard of identity that does go back a ways that includes eggs, because traditionally, of course, mayonnaise is made with eggs. So not a big surprise there, but of course, there have been products on the market for years that don't use eggs, and they may use different types of words on their labels to, convey what they're doing. But in this case, Hampton Creek was just going with its brand name, just Mayo. And so Unilever, being the owner of the Hellmann's and the Hellmann's brand being, the largest conventional brand on the market, didn't like the fact that Hampton Creek was, getting some success with its Just Mayo product, and so decided to sue the company, claiming that they were deceiving consumers and that they were in violation of the FDA standard of identity around mayonnaise for not using eggs. And, I wrote a lot about this at the time and, use it still in my kind of examples of probably one of the stupidest lawsuits ever brought, and a complete tone deafness on the part of the lawyers at Unilever to sue a startup company that's really trying to make the world a better place, by not using animal products in their mayonnaise. So this completely backfired on the company because of the outcry in the media. And it prompted, other conversations around the FDA rules, and then also a conversation of, between Hampton Creek and FDA. And then ultimately, Hampton Creek did come to an agreement with FDA for certain changes in their label to be able to continue using the Just Mayo brand, but using other terminology as well. So, it's just a really good example of, again, our outdated regulations that were from a time when there just weren't as many products really pushing the envelope. However, it really should be said that there's been vegan mayonnaise on the market for decades, but, I guess they didn't push Unilever's buttons the way that this particular company did.
Well, I think that's really important to point out, because it's the same thing with the dairy industry. Even though you said that, this has been going on for 20 years, it's when the soy milk industry started becoming successful. And now, today, we're talking about the plant milk industry that's worth, $4-point-something billion, and that's a real threat to the dairy industry, which is suffering and which is having difficulty, even with the government buybacks. And this just seems to be about, if someone's not successful and doesn't seem like they're going to threaten you, they don't really pay attention. But as soon as there's a real threat, there they are.
Right, exactly, yeah. And it's the plant-based foods industry in general, the egg, meat, and dairy replacements that we estimate it being $4.9 billion, and then within that, it's probably $2 or $3 billion of that, maybe over $3, that is represented by plant milk. So there's no question. Plant-based milks is the largest category and the most matured, and yes, obviously the category that's threatening the milk industry the most. But as we see the rise of these other categories, we're going to continue, and obviously in the Dairy Pride Act, they're going after all dairy alternatives. So, one way to look at this situation is in a positive way, because, yes, these companies are, increasingly getting into the mainstream market. We're seeing an awakening by consumers that they're shifting away from animal foods towards plant-based and just eating healthier and more aware of where their food comes from and all that good stuff that we've been talking about for years. And so, as these foods really go more mainstream, of course that's going to threaten the status quo and the entrenched industries that unfortunately are behind the times.
Right. And it's interesting to note, of course, that Hellmann's went on to make and market their own vegan eggless mayonnaise, because of course there's a market and that's what it's about. And they called theirs carefully crafted dressing and sandwich spread, which is it's mayonnaise basically is what it is. But so interestingly, it looks like a lot of that language had to do with mayonnaise versus mayo, because there's a lot of vegan mayos out there. It looks like mayo is not one of the standards of identity. It was just mayonnaise that was. So a lot of these vegan eggless mayonnaises call themselves mayo, and that's okay, it seems.
Well, I would say that that's the word that they've landed on that they hope is okay. I mean, we don't know for sure, but at least Hampton Creek is continuing to use that term, again, with some additional changes to their label. So, yes, I think we can probably safely assume that the word mayo is okay. But it should be said not necessarily as a statement of identity, but just as, Hampton Creek is using it as a brand name. But there also has to be a statement at the bottom, and I believe they added something that says something like sandwich spread. So, it's not all a slam dunk. I mean, FDA rules are rather complicated. But, at the end of the day, like, no one's trying to fool consumers. I mean, this is the other really ridiculous part of this. I mean, these companies are very proud of the fact that they're not using any animal ingredients, and that's why consumers are flocking to them. So, it's really about accurately conveying to the consumer what these products are about. And, there's not really a problem in that regard, but unfortunately, again, we have a regulatory system that's just out of date.
Well, on that note, I want you to talk about Plant-Based Foods Association, because it does seem to be the first trade group of its kind. And I'd love to hear about why you started it and how you're responding specifically to the Dairy Pride Act.
Well, it was, inspired by the issue that we're discussing now, and I realized that as this industry is growing and, again, becoming more popular among just mainstream consumers and no longer a niche industry in a handful of natural food stores, it means that the importance of having a collective voice just has become stronger. And, so it's been almost a year since we launched officially, and we're at 70 members. So there's been, a real incredibly positive or outpouring, I would say, of response and people who want to be part of it. We also have over 40 affiliate members. So it's just been very satisfying to, have kind of hatched this idea, spent many months getting it off the ground, and now seeing that, the people agree this is needed. And people are also just so excited to support each other. I mean, there's a real community being built among the member companies and the affiliates that provide services. And so I feel like I'm honored to really be helping to connect all these people to support each other. And, it can be very challenging work. But as far as the
so just let me just interrupt you for a second. So just because there's so many people who don't even understand what a trade group is. So this is an organization that encompasses companies that make plant-based food products, and this is a way to give them a collective voice.
Right.
Okay.
So, and the best way I can explain what a trade group does is to go back to where we started and say that, the conventional food industry, whether it's Coca-Cola, McDonald's, or the meat and dairy industries in the form of the Cattlemen's Beef Association, you name the kind of dark side of the food industry sector, and they have a trade group representing their interests in Washington and in promotion and in many, many ways. And they're able to spend $1 gazillion, to lobby, to get all the wrong rules in place and to promote their mostly unhealthy, unsustainable food. So that's the system we've had for decades, and it's a model that's worked pretty well for those sectors, and it's something I've spent a lot of my career shining a light on and explaining why what those groups are doing are a problem. And then it occurred to me, the tactics themselves, there's nothing really wrong conceptually with forming a trade group. It's certainly not illegal. It's a well-honored tradition by corporate America, and so I figured, why not take those same tactics and put them to use on behalf of the right side of the food industry and the companies that are really working hard to do the right thing and to shift our system in a more positive direction. So that was the idea, to really bring these companies together to form have a collective voice in policymaking and in promotion. I mean, it's all kinds of activities that we're planning and will be engaging in as the organization grows. So that is the idea. And then, of course, when something happens like this, I mean, what's happening right now, this attack by the dairy industry, is really, again, one of the most important reasons for having a trade group in place, because without it, it would just be up to individual companies to try and, deal with the response. I mean, who made this happen on the dairy industry side was the dairy lobby, right? I mean, this isn't something that Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin dreamed up herself, the senator. I mean, obviously she was put up to it by her constituents in Wisconsin to do this. So that's why a trade group is needed on the defense side now, to make sure we have a collective response and say, well, you know what, this is an industry too, and we have a collective voice, and these are strong players, and, so that's the idea, is to really provide that collective voice that individual companies on their own simply aren't able to do.
Thank you for explaining that, and thank you for doing it, for forming it. So can you tell us then, what is your response to the Dairy Pride Act?
Oh, well, our response is that first of all, it's unnecessary. I mean, as we said earlier, no one's really confused or harmed by the labeling of soy milk and almond milk or any of the other cheese alternatives, I will say, while it's true that traditional dairy products have for years contained animal ingredients, we are really seeing just an explosion of innovation happening where companies are using similar culturing and fermentation techniques and applying that to plant-based ingredients like almonds and cashews. So, there's really just the way we've seen for years, people making milk from almonds and soy. So, there's no reason that the dairy industry should have a lockdown on words like milk and cheese and yogurt just because that's the way it's always been, that those products have come from cows, when in fact, the word milk, of course, is used in many different contexts, coconut milk and so forth. So that's the just kind of logical reaction to it. It's like, well, why should they get to have the only sector to have the right to use these terms, when the idea for the plant-based food companies is to, again, convey to the consumer an expectation of the product. So one way I think about it is if a product tastes like yogurt, feels like yogurt, happens to be made from an almond, doesn't come from a cow, why shouldn't the company be able to use the word yogurt on that product, as long as they are accurately conveying, and all of them do. Not only is it that companies want to make sure that people know that they're using more sustainable ingredients, but just from a allergy and lactose intolerant perspective, I mean, they'd be crazy not to tell someone, hey, you know what, you can safely consume this product. I mean, again, so many people, by some estimates, maybe even 2/3 of the American population are either lactose intolerant or allergic to dairy. So there's a huge market for these types of products. And so, these companies want to be out front. They're looking for those consumers who are seeking these types of products. And so that's our, my just philosophical response. And then as far as what we were actually doing, so we have sent letters of response to the FDA, which we had already started a conversation with last fall. So this is a follow-up letter to them, and then also acknowledgement of this current activity, clearly stating that our members are in no way, shape, or form in violation of any labeling laws, despite what the dairy industry might be claiming. And we also sent letters to the offices of Senator Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin and Representative Peter Welch from Vermont, the leader in the House for the House companion bill to the Senate Dairy Pride Act.
So you, as the trade organization, have done that. What can individuals do? Well,
I mean, I would say, certainly if you live in one of the states that have representatives that have signed on to these actions, to let your representatives know. And so on the Senate side, it's just been Tammy Baldwin. So if you're in Wisconsin, definitely let her know you're not happy with it. On the House side, there were actually 6 different members of the House who had a hand in introducing the companion bill, so you can easily find out who they are. There were also, back in December, 32 members of Congress who signed on to a letter directed to FDA specifically about milk labeling. So you could look up that letter and see if any of those members represent, where you are. And it's really important to let your political representatives know that you're not happy with what they're doing, because they only hear from the dairy lobby, right? The people with money that hand them checks. But they absolutely need to hear from voters that certainly still have the democratic power to vote them out of office. So that's one thing people can do. And then they can support groups like ours that are fighting this type of bill, and there are some other advocacy groups out there that certainly work on similar issues. So, there's no shortage of ways these days to get engaged, get involved, and become an informed citizen taking part in our democracy. And Lord knows we need more people doing that now more than ever.
Indeed. And where can people find you to support the work you're doing?
So our website is plantbasedfoods.org, one word, plantbasedfoods.org, and you'll find links from there to all of our social media. We're, easily found on the internet. People can get in touch with me if they have questions, and my information is on the website as well.
That's fantastic. Michele, thank you so much for what you're doing and for taking the time to talk about it. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Colleen. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Again, that's plantbasedfoods.org if you'd like more information. As we've talked about, language is all about usage. It determines and reflects cultural references. The dairy industry is holding on to a single archaic definition of the word milk, despite the fact that the public understands and uses many definitions of the word. It's the lactation fluid of all mammals, human and non-human mammals. Breast milk is a common and culturally shared term. Milk is the word used in the pharmacological sense to refer to milk-like pharmaceutical preparations, such as milk of magnesia. Milk is in the name of some plants, such as milkweed or milk pea, milk lentil, milkwort. And it's the word we all understand to mean the fluid extracted from plants, such as nuts, such as almond milk and coconut milk, hazelnut milk, peanut milk, and cashew milk. It is the word we all understand to mean the fluid extracted from seeds, such as in hemp milk, or from grains, such as rice milk, or from legumes, such as soy milk. Language is a fluid, organic, living thing. Like it or not, language is not static. It's not fixed. Words come and go. They're borrowed and they're loaned out. Pronunciations evolve and meanings change, even while various and sometimes contradictory meanings exist alongside one another. The dairy industry's desire to hold on to the word milk to only mean lacteal secretions from cows has nothing to do with a sentimental attachment to a word they want to preserve for posterity. It has everything to do with using semantics to control the marketplace for a product whose certain demise they recognize. The best thing they could do for the sake of the cows, for the sake of the earth, and all who live in it is to give up the past and embrace the present as well as the future. The public is not only determining the usage of the word milk, it's also determining the future of food. The dairy industry might take a cue from Silk. Remember Silk, the hugely popular brand of plant milks? They started as soy milk that was first developed by a dairy company who recognized the profits to be made in plant milks. And Silk went out on its own, and it's now being acquired for $10 billion. There are profits to be made in plant milks, and the dairy industry would do well to surrender to this fact and to the fact that the word milk legitimately refers to that which comes from plants. This is Colleen. Patrick-Goudreau, thank you for listening to Animalogy, changing the way we talk and think about animals and plants.